a very warm welcome and great to see you and looking forward to this session. So it's all yours now.
Lovely. Cheers, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, it's an illustrious audience. I think looking around, I recognize many faces. Most of us have kind of been kicking around this space of Steve's friends, associates, and project and change and program management and all that stuff for quite a few years now. This conversation this afternoon was really just thinking about change leadership and contrasting that maybe to ordinary leadership and what makes a great change leader. And I've got a bit of an agenda that I'll go through in a moment. We will be using a bit of interaction because it's a conversation. So I've got a Menti set up, the code's there. If you go to menti.com, I've also put it in the chat. If anybody can't find that, we'll come. I'll refresh that when we get to that part of the conversation. I think probably most of you know me anyway, because we have bounced around Steve's events for the last few years, and we kind of will have seen each other at different events. But just as a quick introduction, as Steve said, I work for an organization called Changemaker, and we're in the space of helping people make change happen, basically. Some of that's through helping design change programs, some of it's through helping to deliver change programs. And the piece that I particularly have an interest in, born out of probably many years of frustration of seeing change being delivered, which didn't engage people. And then people, to the conversation Eddie and I were having earlier, would go, oh, this number of changes failed. 70% of all changes fail. And it was kind of a no, no, we're going to knock out any swear words. So a know something Sherlock moment, you know, so which was, yeah, well, that's because you never involved any of the human beings in the change, you know. So we spend a lot of time working with organizations, people, teams, leadership teams around actually how you engage people in change, how you shift behaviors, cultures. And some of that is how you shift behaviors and cultures in leadership, because funnily enough, most change needs to be led. So that's just a very quick introduction to who I am, what we do. The sort of conversation highlights that I thought we'd touch on today was a little bit around why change leadership matters, probably preaching to the choir on that one, but also then thinking about what makes a great change leader and getting a bit of a view from yourselves on what makes a great change leader. Maybe a bit of a thought and a conversation around why I think change leadership is different to leadership in a traditional sense, and some of the challenges that come with that around equipping our leaders to lead change as opposed to leading their organization or their team. And then I just wanted to share some research. As Steve mentioned, we work with an organization called Lumina Learning. They do a lot of work around human and business psychology and how people connect and get on together. And we work with them because I find them particularly human. They don't label people. They use language that's really easily accessible, human language. But they did some research into what styles of leadership most engaged people in change, and I just thought that'd be an interesting thing to share, and just to share a little bit of that feedback, and then finishing up with, you know, how do we help people become great change leaders? So that was kind of the highlights of the conversation. As Steve says, if you've got any questions, then feel free to chuck your hand up, and we'll have a quick chat. There is some content to get through, so at the same time I'll kind of moderate that, and if we end up going off down lots of interesting little back alleys, then I might sort of call time on some of that stuff, but more than happy to do. Yeah, it's a conversation, it's supposed to be interactive by definition, isn't it? So just around why change leadership matters, you know, we could all throw out lots of quotes and lots of statistics and all sorts of interesting stuff, couldn't we, around the pace of change, around, you know, if you're old enough, you go back to quoting Jack Welch, that probably puts me in a certain category of management. All sorts of different stuff around why change leadership's important. I actually framed it in the context of what we think as an organization, and actually we're just passionate about creating people and organizations that can actually thrive in a massively changing world, not just survive. Because so much of us, what we see is people just trying to survive change. And that's kind of not good enough. We need to be able to do more than just survive, all the adversity of the slings and arrows that are thrown to us by world events, by organizational events, by individual things that are happening in our life. So for me, and for us as an organization, change leadership really matters because it's about helping us to move into a place where we thrive, not just survive. I've got three favorite quotes that I've kind of thrown into a presentation, because a presentation, it has zero value if it doesn't have really interesting quotes that are in there from famous people. And so I thought I'd start that off with one from me, just to set a really low bar for this. So not a famous person, but just in terms of my view on change and change leadership, I'm actually really concerned that if we don't get better at this stuff, collectively, we will become the dinosaur generation. And what I mean by that is, in reality, if we don't help the people around us and the generations that are following us get better at doing change and leading change, then what are we going to leave behind? Because we're living in a world where everything around us is moving so quickly that if we don't get better at doing change, I shudder to think where we'll end up. So that's kind of my dinosaur generation quote, and that kind of is what drives me to do all these conversations and all of the stuff that we do, helping us get better at doing change. But I kind of was interested in that conversation to get some interaction going and get some thoughts from you. So this is the first Menti question. And it's just a question around, from your perspective, what makes a great change leader or a great leader of change? And just sort of reflect back, you might have been involved in some programs that have been amazingly successful. You might have been involved in some programs that have actually been really rubbish, but the leader has really helped you get through those. So as in your experience as someone who's been involved in change, I was just interested to get you to start to throw some words or thoughts into a word cloud around what makes a great change leader. So I've just thrown that up on the screen now, so that'll just continue, and feel free to put more than one word in, put a couple of words, a couple of entries in, and we'll just let that build. So you can see that building as well as it goes along. Cool. So we're getting a few things come through there, different ways of describing it, but communication's coming up quite a lot. So we're getting communication narrative, flexible communicator. We're getting communication. Obviously, some of you have used the word empathy quite heavily. So that sort of sense of empathy with people, empathy with what's happening. Visionary, talking to, there's some other stuff in there about strategic vision. There's kind of a mix of things in there as well around a lot of sort of behaviors stuff. So sort of inspirational, adaptable, some of the stuff around that's maybe a bit more structural around communication, around having clarity. It's really difficult doing this when it keeps moving around the screen and you look at a word and it suddenly shifts off to another direction. Okay, that's cool. So just a few thoughts there around what makes a great change leader from your perspective. And I thought that was an interesting way to start this conversation. Avoid the sacred cow effect. Cool. There's some interesting things in there. Just as a note, what I'll do with these is, when Steve, obviously we'll publish the video afterwards, but we'll probably circulate the presentation as well, and I'll capture these results into the deck when we circulate it, Steve, so people can see what the results were here as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I thought would just be interesting is to sort of share some of our experience and maybe put a little bit of structure around all of those different comments around what makes a great change leader. Yeah, and where we kind of directed this was around a conversation about the human connection. And if you're talking about what a great change leader is, how do they engage the audience? How do they engage people in change? And for us, that was a very much a human conversation, a human connection. And there's all sorts of different things that play into that. But when we talked about a great change leader, we kind of think about three, based on our experience, three sort of core principles, if you like. One of these came up quite a lot in that sort of word cloud, which was there's something around communication style. A great change leader actually is conscious of communication style. It's an important part of how they lead, understanding how expressing ideas and sharing information changes in the way that we interact with different people. So communication style was kind of one key pillar of creating an engaged audience. The second key pillar actually for us was self-awareness. So that conversation around, as a leader, am I actually able to recognize my own way of communicating, my own preferences? Am I able to recognize my own style? Do I have a language for describing that? And also, do I understand what my natural behavioral tendencies are? So we will all, it's not that we're any one thing as human beings, but we all have a natural preference for the way that we engage with other people. And self-awareness, the understanding of what that preference is, we tend to find is critical to building that human connection and that engaged audience, because it's just too easy to do the thing that comes naturally to us. And it can make us a kind of a one path, a one way of engaging with people, which will work for some people, but will equally not work for other people. The third piece of the human connection and a great change leader from our perspective and our sort of experience, and this actually came up, I think, in a couple of the word clouds, is emotional intelligence. So if we think about self-awareness in the sense of actually what's your style and your personality and your preference around how you see and interact with the world, the emotional intelligence piece is a bit more visceral than that. It's actually the ability to recognize, to understand, and even to manage our emotional reactions. And again, that gets heightened in change. Change typically will make people feel uncomfortable, whether you're a leader of change or a recipient of change. Some people will feel a lot less uncomfortable and be quite happy in an environment that's fairly fluid. But for a lot of people, that sense of change will create a sense of uncertainty. Actually, that can even move to a trigger of an emotional reaction, whether it's triggering your fight, flight, freeze, that sense of I want to maintain safety, I want to maintain structure around me. So being able to understand actually the emotional component of how I'm feeling as a change leader, but also recognize the emotional component of how others are feeling as a change leader is super critical to being able to engage with that audience. So in the context of how do you create human connection? How do you engage an audience? We kind of see these three things as being critical to that conversation. How we can understanding the power and the effect of our communication style, but being aware of our own preferences in that and being cognizant to the response of people emotionally. Why are people picking up on that question around why do people see change in that as potentially a threat or uncomfortable? I think it comes in a couple of different senses. As I say, for some people, change will actually be quite something they quite look forward to. It's kind of exciting, it's different. But equally, we've kind of been programmed over probably millennia to look for safety, look for security. And when things happen around us that are unexpected or are different to what we are anticipating as the norm, it creates a sense of uncertainty. It's interesting. I mean, a bit of a sidebar conversation, but some of the neuroscience that they do nowadays, when you think about fight, flight, freeze reactions, you think about adrenaline pumping, all that stuff, and you think about it in the context of history, and it was designed to keep us safe when the saber-toothed tiger rampaged across the veldt in the ice age, and you did fight, flight, freeze, and it kept you safe. What's interesting with some of the latest research is it's suggesting that social threat is as impactful on that fight, flight, freeze reactor as physical threat. And when we go through change programs and change and transition, often in a work context, that can bring some of that social threat in as well. What's this going to mean to me? How will this affect my relationships? How will it affect my work, my life, that sort of side of it? So human connection kind of built around an engaged audience and three key pieces of that engaged audience. And I just very quickly wanted to touch on maybe why I think change leadership is a little bit different to normal leadership. And that's based around my own experiences, but the experience of what we see with the people we work with. You all will have a technical competency. For my sins, my original training and qualification was a finance guy. I was an accountant, and I ended up doing human change. That might tell you something about how much I enjoy doing accountancy, but it's kind of part of my career path. We all have a technical competency. And that technical competency is probably what started our career. We may have changed technical competencies during our career, but as we've grown up and built ourselves in and emerged into leaders, a lot of that will be built around our technical competency. We've probably also developed some business competency. You know, we understand how business works, either through the industry that we're working in, through the sector. When I was a finance guy, we used to send all of our colleagues on finance for non-financial managers courses. Anyone been on one of those? That was kind of an 80s, 90s thing, you know, and that was kind of building business competence because it wasn't part of your skill, your core skill, but you needed to do it to be able to work effectively. And some of that business competency is also maybe around the sector that you work in, around how you do some of the work that you do. I think the challenge that we see is that if you look at where I'm going to pick a number, 80%, 90% of learning and development dollars are spent, it is spent on those two competencies. So as we bring leaders up through organizations, we're bringing them up and skilling and equipping them in technical competency and what I would call business competency. We then put them into a role that says, actually, we don't want you to lead the finance department. We don't want you to lead the sales department, or we don't want you to be an IT leader. We now want you to be a change leader. And the question I have to ask is, how well have we equipped people to lead change? And leading change for me is very much a behavioural competency. It's not about my technical skills as a finance guy or my understanding of how the business works. It's actually about my ability to connect and interact with those around me. It's the human dimension. And actually, I think we spend very little of our development leadership pathway investment in helping our leaders understand how to develop behavioral competency. We almost assume that if you get to a certain level of leadership, you know how to get on and lead people. And then we put you into a very challenging leadership environment, which is leading a change program with all of the challenges that come with that, and expect it to be something you can naturally migrate into. So from my perspective, change leadership is actually quite different to normal functional leadership, if you like. It brings different pressures and different constraints, and it very much relies upon behavioral competency. Now, actually, behavioral competency should be a key piece of ordinary leadership as well. I'm not saying you don't need behavioral competency in ordinary leadership. Yeah, I'll come to that in a sec. It's difficult to read the comments as well as talking, Ian. Yeah. But yeah, I think that change leadership brings in a much heavier burden for leaders to understand how to get on with people. And observationally, I think what I've found is that as leaders have gone into that change leadership piece, the complexity of focusing on the human being has maybe been more than they've been equipped with through their normal development pathway. So this is a quote from Simon Sinek, who's kind of one of my favorite authors. I said I'd have 3 quotes. This is the second one. This one's slightly more famous than me, but I love this quote in that context of a change leader, because he talks about leadership as not about being in charge. I think a lot of our functional leadership history as we've developed as leaders has been about being in charge. It's been about, you know, I am the program manager, I am the head of the function, and it's about being in charge. But he talks about leadership as about taking care of those in your charge. And I think as you go on a change journey, as you move people through change, it's very much in that context of how do we take care of those in our charge? How do we bring them on the journey? I say that from a perspective of having led change programs that involve large redundancies, for example, but you still have a duty of care, even if you are exiting people from the organization as part of that change program. And so it's a different sense of leadership. So if that looks at kind of some of the difference between change leadership in my view and traditional leadership, there's a conversation that I then wanted to sort of spend the next sort of 20 minutes on, which is thinking about what leadership styles actually create engagement for people. So if it's a human connection thing, if it's about behavioural competency, if it's about how we connect with other people around us in the organisation and lead them through change, then what style of leadership, and I'm not going to put it in the context of kind of, is it dominant leadership, is it servant leadership? I'm going to put it more in the context of your style in terms of how you communicate with people and how you engage with people. So more in that context of personality, if you like, but which style of leadership, particularly in the communication sense, really creates engagement with people. And that leads us into some of the research that Lumina did. But I just wanted to start that conversation. So Lumina did some research, which we'll get into in a moment. And it was a small piece of research, but it's really interesting. And I thought it'd be a great session for a conversation like this, where they talked to maybe, I think, 170 odd people who were kind of UK based. So this is UK centric data, professional staff, so people who are in professional roles. And they asked them about how leaders communicate, and in the context of change programs, how that's the communication style influence their engagement in the change program. So all of this is coming from stuff that I probably think we'll all agree on, that actually change is about having engaged people. There's no point deploying a big program of change and then everyone at the end of it just goes, well, why did we do that? I didn't want to do it in the first place anyway. So successful outcomes, benefit realization, all of those good things that we talk about, for me, is predicated on having an audience that is engaged in the change program. And the way that they did that was they took a change program. They did some survey work with the audience, but then they took a mythical change program, if you like, and wrote a comms piece for it, and wrote it in a number of different styles, and then engaged that audience with those different styles and asked them to rate the styles in terms of a few key questions. There's more than this, but because of time, I'll only go through these ones. So things like, how motivated did you feel after being involved in that style of communication? Or how much trust did it engender in the leadership? Or how positive did it make you feel about the change, or open to engaging in the change? So they posed a number of questions basically based on these different styles, and then created a little bit of research and results that came off the back of that, which I'll share in a moment. But just before I do that, I thought, again, it'd be interesting to sort of get a sense from people around the table around your experience of communications and communication styles and how effective you've found them in your lifetime. To do that, I just want to create a bit of shared language for us, and you'll probably recognize this language, but I'll just go through it and create that shared language just so that we have a sense of, when we start to talk about how leaders communicate and how they've communicated change in your experience, which different styles you might have experienced. So this is based around the Lumina language, which we use as a typical way of describing typical preferences that people have. And actually, I've arranged them in opposites. And again, it's not that they're good or bad, right or wrong. They're just different preferences people have for how they communicate. So as you think through these, you might think about which is your preference, but then I'm going to ask you which ones have worked best for you when you've seen people leading change. So one way of communicating might be in a very inspiration-driven way, which is very flexible and adaptable. It's kind of, yeah, whatever happens, we'll kind of work it out when we get there, kind of style of communicating. And the opposite of that is a discipline-driven style, which perhaps is much more about reliability and organization, and is focusing on clear expectations and how we're going to approach the change. Another couple of styles, one might be people focused, which is very empathetic. It's about supportive team culture. That's the style of the communication, ensuring everyone feels valued and heard in that communication. And the opposite of that might be outcome focused, which is very much about it's about the result. It's about performance. It's about accountability. It's about making it happen. It's kind of the style that you might think of as JFDI. And I'll get away with the acronym so we don't have to delete it afterwards. Another set of styles might be language you'd probably be very familiar with, but in this context, an introverted style of communication might be someone, it's not someone who doesn't communicate, it's someone who provides thoughtful and well-considered communication. So it might be a style of communication that's probably is much more focused on the process and the way that we're making the decisions, and that there's care and attention in that. More reflective communication style. The opposite of that would be an extroverted communication style. It doesn't mean that they're doing all of the comms down the pub, but it means that they are promoting open communication. They're very enthusiastic. It's a very engaging style. It's a high energy style of communication. Last sort of more personality based one, we talk about down to earth as a style grounded in reality. Now, this is the data. This is why we're doing it. And this is the practical approach that we're going to take to doing this change, and contrasting that maybe with the slightly more visionary approach, which we call big picture, which is about innovation. It's about new ways of doing things, quite conceptual ways of doing things. It's selling the vision. It's selling the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if you like. And we think about those sort of 8 in terms of personality, but we also think about a couple in terms of sort of more emotional based changes, styles of communicating rather. And we think about what we call reward reactors versus risk reactors. And some people emotionally will be more oriented towards communicating in a very optimistic way. A very confident way, and assuming that there's positive intent all around them. And other people will be perhaps more what we call a risk reactor, which are more vigilant, more modest, and they will communicate perhaps in a way where they're more aware of risks and downsides. So just different ways that people communicate. And I think as one of the comments that came up, it's not that we ever have just one style. We will be a mix of these different things, but actually we probably will have some preferences where we prefer one style over the other, and we might default to a couple of these styles. But in terms of sort of understanding how we engage people in change, I just wanted to put that language out there. And then I wanted to ask you a question, which is on the next Menti, and I'm just going to advance that to the next question now. And I wanted to ask you, which style do you think is the most effective at engaging in change? Now, to address that, there's not only one style. I've given you 100 points and there's 10 items. Now, if you want to be really boring, you could allocate 10 points to each item, but where would the fun be in that? So maybe pick your top 2 or 3, or you might say that's 100 points, go to one of them, but distribute your 100 points over those 10 and answer the question of which style is the most effective in your view at engaging people in change. And what I'm just going to do is, I'm on the screen here, I will flick back to those definitions just in case you want to refer to them while you're answering the questions. And we'll just have a couple of minutes just to answer those questions. Which style do you think is the most effective at engaging people in change, particularly in that communication sense? Now give me a chance to have a slurp of tea. Cool. So let's just see how we're getting on with that. So I'll give it a couple more minutes. See it ticking up. I can see by some of the comments, I just took that opportunity to read some of the comments. So some of you have obviously watched my slide deck before we've got there, because some of my conclusions are quite similar to some of the comments that you're making. But then I'd kind of expect that given the audience that we've got. But it's quite interesting looking at some of the research around it. Okay, so feel free to keep contributing. I'll just put out some of the results now so you can have a look at them, because we can kind of share them as we go together. I obviously didn't know what the results were going to be, so I'm now reconfiguring my talk track, to see how this works as we go along. But that's the beauty of doing a conversation, isn't it? It's great fun. So interesting, a really strong view there around people focused. So in that people focused piece, we were talking about building a style that builds strong relationships, promotes a supportive team culture, everyone feeling valued. Inspiration driven was more of that sort of flexible, adaptable piece. So that's people who may be a style that says, hey, we'll kind of work with it as we go along. I'm very conscious in this that, that you've only had 2 minutes to look at those definitions. So that there's a degree of variability that's going to be built into this. And then down the bottom, we've got extroverted, and I'm actually, outcome focused is kind of third on there. So if that's which style is the most effective at engaging people in change, the other question I wanted to ask you is a little bit of the practical application of that, which is actually, which style do you see used most often? So in theory, if that's, if people focused is the style that's most effective, that's the style you'd see most often. But I'm going to get you to cast your mind back to the change programs you've been involved in and ask you again, spread your points around, and let's have a look at which style you have seen used most often. And I'm not just looking at successful change programs, I'm looking at all the change programs you've been involved in.
Will you put those definitions up again, Paul?
I will indeed. There you go.
Thank you.
Another minute or so. Yeah, cool. Got quite a few responses in. So let's just reveal the results and see what it looks like. Okay, that's interesting. So it's not quite a straight inversion of the previous slide, but it ain't far off. So I'm going to see if Menti will let me flick between the slides. Yes, it will. So at the top previously, to Eddie's question, it's probably at this stage I'm thinking about a leader communicating to an audience. So it's in that sense of his leadership or her leadership style when they communicate. So what you think are the most effective ones: people focused, inspiration driven, outcome focused, least effective, extroverted. When you talk about which ones do you see used the most often, discipline driven, outcome focused, so that would be up there in both of them. Big picture, and then actually inspiration driven, you've dropped down to the bottom, and those ones around sort of that more practical, down to earth, and that sort of more reflective communication style. So again, I'll publish these when we send the deck out, because I think it's just really interesting to get some feedback from an audience like this around how they see these styles being used. So just to recap, that's the styles that you think are most effective, the audience thinks are most effective, and then that's the style that you see used most often. So what I wanted to do was share a little bit of the Lumina research, and just quickly give you their view based on the research that they did, and how that came over. So let's just go back here and just flick through a couple of slides. So what the research found. When they went through and did this research, they basically, as I said, talked to sort of 100 and odd people, 170 people, and they did vignettes. They did little captions or little stories, change comms pieces in all of the different styles. And they asked some specific questions. And so they asked questions like, how did that style make you feel from a motivational point of view? Did it motivate you? So just clicking through some of these results. So when they asked that question of the audience around from a motivation point of view, actually the communication styles that came out as the most motivating were extroverted. So that's that sense of talking with enthusiasm and positivity, followed by reward reactor. So that was that sense of optimism in the way that it was communicated. At the other end of the scale, actually the inspiration driven. So that sense of, yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Very flexible, adaptable, made people feel less motivated, and outcome focused, which was that kind of strong sense. Yeah, Leanne, no worries. That strong sense of this is performance, this is what we need to achieve, and this is about accountability for achieving it, came over created a much lower level of motivation. I've got probably 3 or 4 examples, so I'll just click through those. One of the other questions they asked was how much trust those communication styles engendered in you in the leadership. So again, that positive sort of enthusiastic style of extroverted created a lot of trust. What was really interesting, and again, this comes back to mixing styles, was the paradox that actually very close in terms of creating trust was that more introverted style, that more reflective, that more intimate way of communicating. And actually, the third one was down to earth, which is again that more sort of practical, reliable style of communicating. So from a trust point of view, a real paradox going on there, suggesting that actually different styles worked for different people really effectively. But again, the bottom two, inspiration driven and outcome focused. They then asked the question around clarity and how clearly the message came across. So through that lens of clarity, actually that's where you started to see some of the more structured communication styles coming through. So discipline driven, so talking to that style that's perhaps more around organized, reliable, setting clear expectations, and also the down to earth style. So that's sort of grounded in reality, practical approach to what's happening with the change. And again, introverted was there as well. And at the bottom, they switched around, but the bottom one was inspiration driven and then outcome focused. When they asked the question around how positive it made the audience feel about the change, the ones that made the audience feel most positive, I guess as you'd kind of expect, were back to the optimistic, enthusiastic approach, and that sense of enthusiasm and belief and optimism about the future. The ones that made people feel the least positive, again, were those our favorite two of inspiration driven and outcome focused. They asked then a question around how open do you feel to engaging in the change, having been communicated to in this way? And that's where people focused came up. That sense of communicating in a collaborative, empathetic way really helped with engagement, and probably why it came out quite highly in your responses because of the way I framed the question. But also engagement came out quite strongly with extroverted and reward reactor again, that sort of sense of enthusiasm and optimism. And again, the bottom two were inspiration driven and outcome focused. And then the overall sort of summary was they asked a question, they asked a number of different other questions, which I haven't put on here, but they're in the research paper. They asked a question around what was your overall view of the quality of the message based on those different styles? And again, you get this bit of paradox going on because a lot of people suggesting that they really felt it was a great message when communicated in an extroverted way, enthusiasm, positive, engaging. But also a lot of people communicate suggesting that they felt it was a great message when it's communicated in that more reflective, introverted way. And again, overall, as you'd be no surprise, that based on the previous ones we looked at, inspiration driven, outcome focused at the bottom. So a couple of thoughts just or observations coming out of that, just as we wrap up, and then we can have a chat about this and a discussion about it for the last 10 minutes or something. To one of the points that was in the commentary or in the questions in the chat, actually no one style wins. There is no perfect style. It's a blend of different styles. But there is certainly some styles that come over consistently as being really important. So styles like that enthusiastic, sociable, upbeat messaging is really important to engaging people, and that's kind of typified by that extrovert style. But while no one style particularly wins, there's really interestingly one style that definitely lost, and that was that outcome focused style. And that was the style I talked about it as JFDI, and that's the sense of it's very direct, it's very tough, it's saying this is what we have to do, this is let's just make it happen, let's go ahead and do it. And I guess that's kind of part of why I found this really interesting, because my observation is similar to some of the observation in the Menti that you did, that the style one of the styles I see most often used in change programs is that outcome focused style. It's leadership going, this is what we need to do, go do it. And creating that lack of engagement as a result. Another observation, paradox is a really valuable tool in communications, actually, which is back to the no one style. So blending that extroverted enthusiasm, but following it up with some more intimate one-to-one conversations, small group conversations. It isn't a one style fit all. And also different styles support different objectives at different times in the change program. So if your objective is to create clarity, you're doing a progress update or something, actually consciously framing it more in that discipline driven or down to earth language is really helpful. Whereas maybe when you launch it or when you're giving a different type of communication, you might lean more into that extroverted side. Also, you can overwork it. So you've probably all been involved in the rah-rah speeches where extroverts gone over the top and it just becomes a droning noise that everyone switches off to because it's just loud and noisy and isn't based in reality. So we can overextend in any of these styles. And in that context, I just wanted to sort of end up by talking a little bit around what we see as the stuff that really works and what's really important to creating great change leaders. And it's based on that belief that change is a deeply human activity. It's not a process, it's not a technology, it's about people doing something different. And the best leaders of change are the ones that put people at the heart of everything they do. And they shape the culture, they inspire, they create belief, they create lasting impact. But that raises the question of, well, how do they do that? How do you put people at the center of everything? And a few of the things that we've kind of picked up and talked to people about is actually being very, so a bit of that self-awareness one, being very conscious of the communication style in the way you're planning comms. So often when we do change programs, it's kind of, oh yeah, we come up with a comms plan, and that means we just send out a monthly newsletter. We default to all of the standard things, but actually it's seeing the more nuanced side of communication, that's actually understanding how you use different styles in communication to get your outcomes you're looking for. It's about having leaders that are really invested in self-awareness. And that's probably the biggest thing that I see in change programs, is actually having leaders who take the time and are open to really unpacking, how do I operate? What are my preferences? What are the defaults that I'm going to? How are other people observing the way that I am connecting with them, as opposed to how do I observe what I think is what I'm doing? And creating that language and openness to understanding preference and how they actually can adapt and have to adapt. I was working in an organization a few months back, and this was kind of the almost the blocker that we got to, that the leadership team had one particular style, and they kind of recognized that they had that style. They wanted an entirely different outcome for the organization, but they weren't willing to change their own style. And that created a disconnect that will forever haunt that organization as it goes through their change program, because they haven't got that self-aware and desire to change the way they work. You can do things like build behavioral frameworks, make it explicit around what good looks like in terms of behavior and style, so that people have a way to be accountable for those behaviors during a change program. Normal sort of good stuff like coaching and mentoring and feedback loops, all things that are really important to getting that change leadership capable to create real engagement. And I guess the final thought that I have for leaders and change leaders particularly is in that sense that attitude and approach is a choice. We actually can choose how we engage with people. And it's our ability as leaders to exercise that choice, whether that's in emotional intelligence, whether that's in communication style, whether it's in how we connect and adapt to build rapport with different people. We have the opportunity to exercise that choice, but it's a choice that we have to make. And it's not something we can project onto other people that, oh, that's their job to do that, or actually I'm not changing, this is the way we run the business. I mean, that's a personal choice as a leader, but it may not engage people in the change that you're trying to make. I said that I'd had 3 quotes. This is kind of my 3rd quote, and this is kind of how I think about what a great change leader is. It's a lady who was a social activist in the US called Maya Angelou, and she's got or she had, she's passed away now, but she had a lovely way of describing change. And I think for me, that kind of sums up change leadership. It's not actually, even in the context of sort of business outcomes and benefit realization, when you're leading change, it's not about what you did. It's not about what you said. It's actually about how you made the people feel in the change program. Were they part of it? Did they feel, to Sinek's quote, that you cared for them as you led them? Because if you don't, they won't engage, and you will not get the outcomes that you're looking for. So that was kind of my final thought. As I said earlier, if you want a copy of the research paper, just ping me. Contact details are up there. If you scan the QR code, it will download my contact details to your phone or whatever. But I was going to stop yakking on at that point and open it up for some questions and some thoughts.
I've got one, maybe. Well, we haven't talked necessarily about reputation and results, and I've seen it in the sense of that I felt that I've been in the presence of a great change leader, and I wasn't looking in the mirror, but they still presided over what was a disaster effectively. So it might have made people feel really good, but just having a great change leader doesn't necessarily guarantee success. And should a great change leader be judged against success as much as how well they leave the people they worked with feeling? Open question. Because again, how do you get the next job? Case in point, I might, because I've personal knowledge, Crossrail. Crossrail in a heap, rescued to a degree. That person now in charge of what I would think is a ticking time bomb. Are they going to pull that out the clag as well as they did for Crossrail? I'm not holding my breath. And yet, great guy. And there's another phrase, a bit like your JFDI. You can't polish a. What if the actual pool that you're working with, the people that you're working with, just aren't savable, rescuable, able to be led even to the quality required? But that's great learning as well, because that should point whoever's organising overall, whatever that operation is, should say, hang on a minute, we've got. I can't think of any great football managers at the moment, but we've got that great football manager, but we've got a team that are basically the equivalent of what used to be the 4th division.
Yeah.
What must we do?
Yeah, I kind of get that, and I guess for me that kind of comes back. So in my context, in the context of this conversation, it's not saying that the engagement of the human being, if you like, in the change is the only thing that successful change is predicated on. And if I kind of went back to our kind of initial slide and the way we work, actually for us it's predicated on 3 things. It's design the change properly in the first place, which means you're doing the right things in the right way, deliver the change effectively, which is all of that good program, project management, risk management, all of those things. But also you can do both of those things really well, and if you haven't engaged the human being and done the human change, you still won't get the outcomes you're looking for. I think we had a hand up from was it Rebecca? I can't.
Yes. Yes. One thing that seems to be missing from some of this research that you presented is the fact that we have to know our audience, and the leader needs to be versatile. I can't just always default to the mode of communication that I prefer. If I constantly do that, I'm going to be approaching most people in a manner that doesn't match their style, and most people are a combination of styles. Depending on time and circumstance. So it's situational based too. And I think that one thing that I have noticed, because I do a lot of shadow management coming behind leaders, is that they often make pronouncements and then don't follow up individually. Whether it's the next tier down or even with the broader scope of individuals to do the change, to assist in producing this change. So I think communication is so multi-layered and so complex that we have to help leaders understand that they're not the important piece of this cog machinery working. It's the team. And if, as Steve said, some of them just aren't going to be capable of making change happen, but you can't really get to that point till you've met them on their plane, till you've talked to them and understand. So we need to be active individuals in our own communication. And as leaders, we need to train ourselves as how to be flexible in that communication. One-on-one, I see many leaders who are a bit more flexible, but the minute they're challenged, the backup style comes up and it's often directive. And we also tend to choose leaders that match the leader that chose them. And we need to be careful about that, because we think doesn't get action done, because we think is what got the platform that needs to be changed. So we need to be very, very careful. Thank you.
No, I totally agree with those, Rebecca. And it's part of the conversation we have with leadership teams around cognitive diversity. We tend to recruit to type, We recruit people like us because often they're the people we connect most easily with in an interview situation, for example, or they fit most easily into the culture of the organization. But that cognitive diversity piece is about actually how you value people who think very differently, and it's one of the most effective ways of creating great problem solving teams. I also, I think it's kind of where I was going with that self-awareness point as well, around recognizing our style and actually understanding how we do connect with people with different styles, and being situational. I think the key thing for me is it's about the leader actually being open enough to do exactly what you're talking about, and to recognize they do have a certain style, and to wrap some language around that, be willing to accommodate change and difference, not necessarily to be incongruent by being something they're not, but by recognizing that different people will have different needs, and potentially using other people in the team to address some of those needs. Because it's not all about one person leading either. It's actually about a leadership cohort that can reach people who have very different ways of receiving information. I think Bob was the next hand, and then Ian's got one.
You there, Bob? Yep.
You're on mute, Bob.
How about that?
That's better.
Right. Sorry. Okay. Now I'd be interested in your comment on the approach that I used to often take, which was that I would divide all the people that I was working with into three. A third of them would I know, because I would know the people, be supportive. Another third couldn't care less. And the last third would fight me. So my tactic, and this is just a tactical approach really, was go for the people. Well, first of all, don't take on the people that are going to fight you first. Go for the people that you know will support you. Follow it up with the people that couldn't care less, but you can always say, well, this number of people have agreed with it. And then by the time you get to the people that are going to fight you, you know that you've got a very big majority, and they're not in a very good position to stand up to it, as it were. So I just wondered, that kind of tactical approach you didn't really talk about. I just wondered if you got a view on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of put that's almost in the Cotter world of dealing with the no-nos. If you're kind of familiar with his penguins and iceberg and stuff like that, and I think that's a strategy for dealing with change. I think the piece that I'm more focused on here is around how you connect with people within that strategy, if you like. So I don't disagree with your view. You know, it's naive to think that everyone's going to leap on the change bandwagon and think this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But equally, I think that you have to find ways of reaching people. You know, where we work with an approach called ProSci, and that talks about resistance management. And resistance management is kind of, how do you deal with the third that actually don't want to be involved or don't want to support the change. But even with that third, I think you can do things that consciously help you to have a better chance of connecting with them by using these sort of approaches and understanding how to engage with people who have different ways of perceiving the change, if you like.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Bob.
Ian?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. A thought on some of the other prerequisites for a long-term successful and sustainable change. So I'm thinking about the substance of what's being changed, why it's being changed, whether there are hidden agendas or public agendas. Is this so-called business transformation only being done to keep the CEO's pension topped up for 2.5 years before everybody sees through it?
Yeah.
Or so that some venture capitalist can extract a load of money out the company, but then it needs dressing up as something else. So it seems to me that there's a balance, and the more genuine the substance of the change, maybe the less the need for outstanding change leaders, and the good, in inverted commas, and supported change, most of we average folks can lead it through successfully. What's your thoughts on that balance, and where is the role for the sort of substance over the style of a change?
So, yeah, I think a great question, and probably my view is that actually there's, how can I put it? I get that some changes will probably feel like they're more valid than others.
Yeah.
But that validity is still very much cast in the perception of the recipient.
Yeah.
So the ability to engage someone in change still becomes really vital, because you might be, I do a chunk of work in not-for-profits and third sector, yeah. And in that sense, I find it one of the most interesting and challenging areas to do change, because you think everybody's behind the change because it's a social purpose. We all want to make people better. We all want people to have happy lives. We all want people to live longer and be healthy. And there's a sense that because it's a social purpose, it must be a great change that we're deploying, and therefore why wouldn't you want to support it? And yet the very fact that it's in a social purpose driven organization creates often more dissent than in a commercial organization, because it's bashing up against people's personal values and reasons for being in that organization. So it creates a lot more tension. So that's kind of my corollary to, even if the purpose of the change is really good, you still have a lot of issues around, or a lot of challenges around how you bring people on that journey.
Yeah. Which I was thinking about, the substance includes the practices of, are we doing the right thing? Have we spent enough time sort of examining the situation, deciding what to do, not jumping on the first bandwagon that comes along, etc. So I've seen organizations hollow out their internal capability, and it's only 20 years later that the impact's been seen, the negative impact. The people talking about the negative impact were seen as naysayers and change resistors at the time. But they're actually the only genuine ones who were in. So how do you tell the difference between genuine resistor for the right reason and a pain in the backside?
Yeah, and I think that is about the engagement and the two-way conversation. I think someone mentioned earlier in the comments or in questions about two-way conversation. Communication obviously isn't a one-way process. And when we think about these styles, we also are thinking about, how do you engage people in that two-way communication? There's some stats that that came out in a sort of couple of different questions in the surveys, but they were around people's needs to feel involved and valued as part of the change, and to feel that their leaders, they could trust their leaders, that the leaders were doing the right thing by them in the change. And I think that stuff's really important. I would have to say, I don't think it's how many change programs are run, and that's one of the reasons why change isn't successful. So this is just one dimension of what makes change successful. But I kind of come from a school of thinking that says that so much of change is about leadership, and part of that is leadership making the right decisions for the right reasons, but so much of it is about how they take people on that journey with them.
Cool. I sort of listening to the theory in the discussion. Have you ever done a sort of observational session, possibly with performers? Actually watching a group at play, as it were, and trying to sort of use that as a demonstrator.
I've done a few sort of things in that space, but nothing particularly. We did the thing with Jack. At one of your sessions a few years back, where we kind of used actors.
That's true. I almost had a sort of goggle box moment where I thought we should maybe watch something like we do and then comment on it.
Yeah.
And maybe we could try and fix something. I'm just in my head is starting to think maybe we could fix something like that up.
Yeah.
Because it's always that observational. You come out of a meeting and you say, "What did you think of so and so, or that moment, or this moment?" Or and I'm always intrigued by what Lumina Spark gave me, and that I gave to my board, which I said, now you've got a choice. Now you understand everybody using this profile. It's up to you whether you're nice or nasty to them, but essentially you can push their buttons or not, or in a good way or a bad way. Once you've got that, and also the performing change manager, because we'll switch styles. I would imagine in the context of the situation that they find themselves in. So, it's that sort of good cop, bad cop, nice person, listening person, and how do you sort of weave your way through all of that? But having that, I think the underlying fact for me was that at least you understood to a greater or lesser degree what you were doing. You were more in control, more in personal control, and I think that's possibly a good thing to. That sort of inner self knowledge without making it too spiritual, but understanding far more why you're doing it and what you're doing it.
It's a self-awareness piece.
Yeah.
And I mean that tends to be a lot of how we run the workshops that we do with leadership teams. Someone was mentioning about writing a book earlier. The book that I'm doing with a colleague at the moment is around how you create high-performing non-exec boards. So you're throwing a group of people that don't work with each other 5 days a week. They only meet up 3 times a month for a few hours, and yet they are making the most high-stakes decisions, and particularly in not-for-profits, which are very influential around how the NED works with the operational exec and things, and third sector. And we're writing a whole book around the people around the table, how you actually get people who don't know each other really well to interact.
Dare I say, they tend to be people who also have been hired because of what they represent rather than what they can do.
And when we run those sort of workshops, it is all about self-awareness. It's creating some of those in a safe place, some of those honesty conversations where people actually can go, okay, I found that really challenging, the way that you were talking to that information or presenting that question, but now I understand that's your style. Let me help you understand why I found it challenging, because this is my style and how I interpreted it. And you move people to a place of conscious decisions as opposed to emotional reactions or subconscious decisions. Yeah,
good point. Look, I think we're up to getting on for 12 minutes overtime at the moment. I'd also be interested, Eddie, in your listening session. Maybe I'll give you a chat. I'll follow you up on that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, just basic listening skills, because what you find is often, even however good the leader is at communicating out, it doesn't arrive.
Exactly.
And so just working on that, keep the leaders, don't spend any money or time on the leader, because if you're serious at your listening skills, you're watching, you're listening, you're trying to fill the gaps on behalf of the person who you're listening to or taking the information for, and you're doing with a level of empathy. So even if the leader's really rubbish at communication in your style, you still absorb it, or you ask the follow-up questions, which is the two-way conversation.
Again, I've got this thing in my head of going into a meeting briefed fully with your message, so that you're automatically switched off. You're not going to listen to these people because you're there to deliver this, and not take account of what other opinions, other perspectives might be, which may ultimately be better. It's this collaborative consensus thing that makes, I think, for a more constructive experience, even if you lose, in inverted commas. Okay, well, look, I'm going to draw it to a close with a big thank you to you, Paul, because I think we could talk we could talk for hours, and then maybe we'd go and do something about it for a couple of minutes. But
no worries.
No, it's great session.
From CPM's perspective, I want to thank you also, and to say that the next session will be announced here shortly. I need to verify with the speaker we had lined up due to, as many of you probably heard, we're having a government shutdown and massive furloughs. So I need to check with this individual to see their availability. Those that are left are actually trying to perform several jobs. So at any rate, Steve, I'll get you that information here shortly before the end of the week. And I, again, want to thank you. I appreciate the discussion and look forward to the next ones.
Yes, thanks, Becky. So yeah, we'll touch base on that. So I think to wrap it up, we will, or I will get the video and top and tail it and just clear it with Paul before we
Great.
issue it, along with the transcript and the chat. That because there's lots in the chat as well this time.
Yeah.
And get it distributed. So that's it. Thank you very much for attending. Encourage people to watch the YouTube. And again, if you meet anybody, tell them to come along and have a chat and a listen. And we'll see you in about a month's time.
Awesome.
I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Take care. Stay
Yes.
safe.
Bye.